Hey guys, it is finally that time of the season where we'll be doing our jury scenarios for Big Brother 26. Now, this is something that I normally do for each season of Survivor and Big Brother that I cover. We're around the final five. I look at each of the possible final two scenarios that could happen based on this final five and try to forecast who I think would win in each of these scenarios. So, again, pretty interesting stuff here. Now, at the time of recording, there are five players still in the game, those being Cam, Chelsea, Kimo, Mackenzie, and Rubina. And just looking at this field, I think we can almost immediately write off Kimo. Kimo is the main target at this point, and while in the past day we've heard Cam express some interest in wanting to keep Kimo around, I just don't think it's going to go anywhere, and through that, I am expecting Kimo to be voted out on Thursday night, which is a shame considering I think there are definitely some scenarios that I think he does pretty well in, where even though he is a pretty passive player, he is someone who I think would have some jury votes on his side with the likes of Quinn and Angela in particular. So I think Kimo's someone who definitely could have been a big jury threat, but I feel like he's probably going home here. But then moving on to the remaining four players, I think Chelsea is pretty clearly the biggest jury threat here, where you've been hearing everyone in the house talking about how she would win against anyone. She's obviously the big player of the season, and I feel like there are definitely plenty of scenarios where Chelsea should win pretty handily here. Though at the same time, I don't think there are many scenarios where Chelsea wins at a slam dunk, where I feel like a lot of the other people would have some votes even against Chelsea here. So I do think forecasting a lot of these Chelsea scenarios will be pretty interesting. But then moving down the board, I think MJ is someone who theoretically should be dead in terms of a jury vote, where she literally turned on her own allies during her own HOH despite her having all the power there. And despite her winning competition, she has largely been coming off as this puppet for Chelsea that probably should doom her in a lot of scenarios, though judging by the way that the players are talking about her in the house and even reading some of the exit interviews, I don't really get that sense where even Leah, the person who she most betrayed during her own HOH for no reason, didn't seem that upset by MJ, and I actually think would still be willing to vote for MJ in certain scenarios. So I do think MJ is someone who can definitely win in certain scenarios if she gets towards the end. And then we move down to Rubina, who I think could also garner some respect here. I think she'll definitely have some votes in certain scenarios, especially with there being the sentiment of wanting a woman of color to win by the likes of T-Core. I think that will definitely play to Rubina's favor. Not to mention that you have people like Kimo and Cam that would be pretty apt to vote for Rubina in certain scenarios as well. So I think Rubina is also someone who can definitely make some inroads with the jury. But then we have Cam, who I do think is the smallest jury threat left on the board, where even though he seems pretty affable and someone who you would look on paper as someone who is this pretty big player, I don't think a lot of the house really sees him as that, where for one, he has really struggled in a lot of competitions, where out of this final five, he has won the least amount of competitions, which I think is contributing to his perception that he's not really playing the game as hard. And through that, I think that'll probably harm him at the end of the day when it comes to an actual jury vote. And you even see that with the exit interviews, where Angela in particular described him as a floater. So I feel like the jury doesn't really respect Cam's game at the moment. And I think something else that's harming Cam here is this desire for the women to do well in the season, where now in the house you see the likes of Chelsea, MJ, and Rubina talking about wanting an all-women final three. And you even have on the jury people like T-Core, who has openly stated that she wants a woman to win. So I think that's another knock against Cam that will probably harm him in a lot of these scenarios. Now, I don't think it's too late for Cam to turn things around to where if he's able to do things like win competitions in the final four and final three, if he's able to make quote unquote big moves like cutting Chelsea or MJ, I think there's definitely opportunities for Cam to turn around his perception in the eyes of the jury, but I feel like at the time being, he's definitely the least likely person to actually win a jury vote. And then moving over to the jury, we currently have four people in the jury, those being Quinn, T-Core, Leah, and Angela. And again, I feel like this jury mostly is going to be voting based on who they see as the biggest player, and I think they clearly see Chelsea as being the biggest player, and I think that'll definitely help Chelsea in a lot of these scenarios here. Though at the same time, I think there's definitely some interesting quirks to point out here, where first up you have Quinn, the first member of the jury, and there was definitely a lot of discussion online at the time Quinn was being evicted that as the first member of the jury, that Quinn will have a lot of influence in determining how this jury will actually vote, and considering that Quinn is one of the bigger super fans and someone who is probably not as invested in competition wins and is more so seeing the strategic side of things, that Quinn will be able to turn this jury into one that's going to be voting based on the biggest player. And while I don't necessarily agree with this notion that the first juror sets the tone for the rest of the jury, I do think Quinn is someone who has a lot of good relationships with the people in the jury, where even though a lot of people didn't trust Quinn within the house strategically, a lot of them still liked Quinn on a personal level. They're pretty happy to be hanging out with Quinn in the jury house, and I think it'll definitely have some influence, though I don't think it's going to be the be all end all. But then we have T-Core, who I think will be another pretty big influence in the jury, where T-Core has talked pretty openly about how she wants a woman to win, specifically a woman of color, which obviously benefits the likes of Chelsea and Rubina here. Though, another thing to factor in is how people like Kimo or Rubina will vote in the scenarios where all three of them will be in the jury house, where there's also been a lot of talk online about whether T-Core, Rubina, and Kimo will be voting as a block, and through that give whoever they favor a lot of power in a jury vote. And I think T-Core does largely side with Chelsea in a lot of these scenarios, even in scenarios that have Rubina or Kimo in there, where T-Core talked pretty highly about Chelsea in her exit interview. So I think that definitely helps Chelsea a lot in a lot of these jury scenarios. Though at the same time, considering recent events, I'm not as inclined to think anymore that the three of them will be voting together, particularly in scenarios that involve Cam in there, as I feel like Rubina and Kimo are pretty open to voting for Cam, which I guess kind of gets into their perceptions of things. But still, it'll be interesting to see how T-Core is able to interact with a lot of these jurors. And then you have Leah and Angela, the most recent boots on the board. And as I said in my previous power rankings, the two of them should be pretty upset at Mackenzie for the fact that she literally turned on them despite being one of their allies at the time and being one of the few people that wasn't going after Mackenzie. And you definitely get that sense in their exit interviews where Leah talked quite a bit about how she felt betrayed by MJ for her putting her up. And you have Angela openly calling MJ gullible, which I think paints a pretty bad picture in terms of MJ's ability to get their votes. However, I am a bit more up in the air about Leah, where even though Leah talked about how MJ betrayed her and stuff, she also talks about how she wanted to play a loyal game where she felt like she wanted to go to the end with Cam, Chelsea, and MJ, how she herself saw herself as a loyal player, which is a big reason why Leah didn't put him up when she clearly should have. And I think if MJ is able to articulate that, if MJ is able to say that she was simply staying loyal to the people she saw as valuable in the likes of Chelsea and Cam, I think that could possibly turn Leah towards MJ more so than Angela, where I think Angela's probably never voting for MJ in a lot of scenarios. I think Leah is a bit more open to voting for MJ, but I still think this will be an interesting development to see in the coming weeks. So those are my general thoughts on the final five and on each of the jurors currently there. Now, as I said, there are 5 players within the game, meaning there are 10 possible final 2 scenarios that can happen, and I'm going to be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to happen, and forecasting what I think would happen in each of these scenarios. But let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 10, and basically these bottom scenarios are all ones that have Kimo in them, because, as I said earlier, I think Kimo's going home on Thursday night, which would make all the scenarios involving him a lot less likely to happen than the ones that don't have him. But number 10, the final 2 scenario I believe is the least likely to happen from this point on, is Kimo versus Rubina, and obviously this is the case considering they're literally on the block together right now. And unless something crazy happened, like the reset button happening or a medevac, this scenario is pretty much impossible at this point. One of these two are going home on Thursday night. So it's not really worth discussing this in too much detail here, but if the scenario were to happen, I do think it would be relatively close at the end of the day. However, I do have Kimo narrowly squeaking it out, where I think Kimo will get the locked votes of Quinn and Angela, Rubina will get the locked votes of T-Core and Cam, and at that point, it'll be a battle between Leah, MJ, and Chelsea, where I do think MJ probably votes Rubina here, considering she talks pretty highly about wanting a woman to win. You have Leah, who I am putting down as a Kimo vote here, considering that her closest allies in Quinn and Angela are also voting for Kimo. And at that point, it comes down to Chelsea, where I'm not too sure where Chelsea goes in this scenario. But for the purposes of this video, I did decide to give her vote to Kimo here, giving Kimo a win. But again, it's a very tight vote, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because this scenario is not happening. So because of that, it's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and these scenarios are all theoretically possible, as there is a world where Kimo could somehow escape being the target by the end of the week, but even though I think it's highly unlikely. But at number 9, we do have another Kimo scenario, and that is Chelsea versus Kimo. And the reason I don't think this one's likely either is I just don't see Chelsea or Kimo wanting to take each other to the end. I feel like Kimo is someone who has blatantly turned on Chelsea at this point and would probably target her next week if he had the opportunity, which is a big reason why Chelsea is targeting him right now. So through that, I think it's pretty unlikely that these two will get to the end together. Though if it were to happen, I do think Chelsea wins pretty handily here, where even the votes that Kimo would get in a lot of scenarios in Quinn or Angela would probably go to Chelsea here, as I think they simply respect Chelsea's game more, to where the only vote I can see Kimo getting is Rubina, but at the end of the day, I feel like this one's pretty unlikely to happen as well, and I think Chelsea will win it pretty handily, which is why it's here number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another scenario that's very unlikely to happen, and that is Kimo versus MJ. Now obviously MJ is the current HOH and actively targeted Kimo this week, which you would think would make Kimo not want to take her to the end, and truth be told, obviously, Kimo does not want to take MJ to the end, but the reason I think this one's a bit more likely than Chelsea versus Kimo is that I think Kimo recognizes that Chelsea is a bigger threat to win the game compared to MJ, and if he were to somehow survive this week, that he would be more inclined to target Chelsea at Final Four compared to MJ. Now, if this scenario were to happen, I do think Kimo will probably win it, though this is another pretty hazy one, where like Kimo and MJ are people who are kind of sneaky jury threats, or even though their games are not overly impressive, I do think they're people who could definitely surprise some people in a lot of jury scenarios, though obviously when they're against each other, I think it becomes a bit more wonky here. Now, I do think Kimo has more locked jury votes compared to MJ, where I think he gets the votes of Quinn, T-Core, Angela, and Rubina. That should be enough to win here. The question is where the other votes go, and I do think MJ has a lot of potential to get votes here, where I do think Cam and Chelsea probably lean towards MJ here, where even though Cam and Kimo have a pretty good relationship, I'm not entirely sure where Cam would truly stand in a Kimo MJ scenario, so I do think that could be a potential 5th Kimo vote as well, though I could also see Cam voting for MJ to stick by Chelsea here, not to mention that Cam has a crush on MJ, but whatever. And then Lee is another one who I think is kind of up in the air as well. Now, I could very well see her voting for Kimo as well, which would make it a 6-1 vote or a 5-2 vote. But again, I think Lee is another one who could surprise some people, where I think she's another one who, despite being upset by MJ's move, I don't think she's entirely ruled out the possibility of voting for MJ in certain scenarios. So I do think Leah could end up being a surprise MJ vote here as well. So while I think Kimo is seemingly the favorite in this scenario, I wouldn't put it past MJ to steal some votes along the way to make it more competitive, but I do have Kimo winning here, but obviously this one's pretty unlikely to happen, which is why it's here number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have the highest ranked scenario that has Kimo in it, and that is Cam versus Kimo. And I think if Kimo were to survive the week and would try to navigate through the game, I think Cam's probably the person Kimo would be most inclined to want to take to the end, considering he thinks that Chelsea and MJ are bigger jury threats, and obviously with him losing Rubina here, it would kind of force him to want to work with Cam, and considering that the two of them have had a pretty good relationship across the season, I do think the scenario is somewhat likely here, considering that Cam has also considered the possibility of cutting these bigger threats along the way, and I think Kimo would be a pretty viable option for Cam to want to pursue as a way of getting a one-up on Chelsea by the end of it. So I do think if Kimo were to survive this week, I think this scenario does have some legs to stand on here. Now, admittedly, if the scenario were to happen, I do think Kimo once again probably wins this, where I think Kimo once again has more locked jury votes with the likes of Quinn, T-Core, Rubina, and Angela. That's already enough to win. I think he probably also gets Chelsea's vote here, which is kind of strange considering Chelsea and Cam are working together for a lot of the season. However, Chelsea was also very upset by Cam about certain things, particularly with the whole MJ situation, and I don't really see Chelsea being willing to vote for Cam in a lot of scenarios, even though they had this close partnership for a lot of the season. And it wouldn't shock me if Chelsea actually voted for Kimo by the end of it, especially when she knows that Kimo's probably the favorite here. Now, I do think Cam probably gets some votes here. I could see him getting the vote of MJ here. And again, Leah's another one who's pretty much up in the air. I don't really know who she picks between Cam and Kimo, or even though the perception in the house for a lot of the season was that Cam and Leah were the secret duo, I never got the sense that Leah was that close to Cam. And I think with, again, Quinn and Angela being clear Kimo votes, I could see her latching onto that as well. So again, I think this is another scenario that Kimo will probably win, and I think if Kimo survives this week, I think this is probably the scenario that he pushes for the most, but again, I think it's just so unlikely to happen considering Kimo is currently the target, and the things that would need to happen for him to get the target off his back are pretty insurmountable at this point, which is why it's here number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and from this point on, each of these scenarios are ones that probably have more of a shot of happening compared to the ones that have Kimo in them. And it's just a matter of ordering them. By number 6, we have a scenario that I know some people are intrigued by, but I feel like it's kind of unlikely to happen at this point, and that is Cam versus Chelsea. And this is a scenario where I just don't see either of these two wanting to take each other to the end, where Chelsea has talked quite a bit about targeting Cam at Final Four, and even considered pulling the trigger on him this week, though was eventually steered away from that. And I feel like Cam is another person that is unlikely to take Chelsea either, considering he at least recognizes that Chelsea is a big threat. And there have been multiple points during the season where Cam has openly gone against what Chelsea wants. And it wouldn't shock me if at the final three, Cam actually cuts Chelsea. So I don't think these two are pretty likely to take each other to the end. And I think if it were to happen, I do think it would be a pretty close jury vote. I know it's been talked about quite a bit that Cam and Chelsea would actually be a pretty interesting matchup here, which is funny considering Chelsea is widely seen as the biggest jury threat, while Cam is widely seen as the smallest jury threat. But I do think this particular matchup would be pretty close, where on one hand, I think Chelsea clearly gets the votes of Quinn, Angela, and MJ, but then you have that T-Core, Rubina, Kimo trio, where a lot of the talk earlier in the season was that trio is a big reason why Chelsea was seen as a big jury threat, where it's largely been assumed that that trio would hold in that scenario, be locked votes for Chelsea, and obviously make it so that no matter what happens, Chelsea would just need one more vote. But in recent days, it does seem like Kimo and Rubina are pretty open to voting for Cam over Chelsea, which I think makes the scenario a bit more interesting and obviously gives Cam more of a shot here. And then you have Leah, who I think could go either way as well, where I feel like she has good relationships with both Cam and Chelsea, and it's just a question of which one she would go with here. So, admittedly, while I think Chelsea would be the favorite by the end of it, and considering that Chelsea would win this scenario, I think it's also interesting that Cam would get a decent amount of jury votes here, potentially make it a close jury vote by the end of it, but I still think Chelsea will pull it out by the end. But I just don't think the scenario is particularly likely to happen at this current point, which is why it's here number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this is another pretty interesting scenario here, but one that I don't think is as likely to happen as it probably should. But number 5, we do have Cam versus Rubina, and this is kind of a strange one as Cam and Rubina have a pretty good relationship in the house, and you would think because of that Cam and Rubina would be pretty open to taking each other to the end, except they don't really, where on one hand, you have Rubina being pretty open to this Final Three deal with Chelsea and MJ, like to have all three of the women at the Final Three. And then you have Cam, who recently as today has talked about flipping the vote onto Rubina to keep Kimo around. So it's kind of interesting how neither of these two want to actually take each other to the end, despite the fact that they have this good relationship, which I think is part of the reason why the scenario is less likely to happen. But if it were to happen, I do think Rubina wins here, though I think Cam actually does better in this scenario than the Cam and Kimo scenario, where I do think in this scenario, Cam probably gets the votes of Quinn and Leah, and possibly gets the votes of Chelsea, and maybe, just maybe, get MJ's vote, though I think the challenge here is that I think MJ is someone who has talked more openly about wanting to take Rubina and Chelsea towards the end, how she kind of buys into this all-woman Final Three, which I think kind of harms Cam's perception there. And then I think mixing in T-Core and Angela and Kimo all being clear votes for Rubina in this scenario, I do think Rubina pulled it out by the end of it, though I do think Cam would have more of a shot here than in the Cam Kimo scenario, which is one that he entertained as recently as today. But again, I feel like considering that these two seem to be at odds at this point, where even though they have this good relationship, they don't actually want to take each other to the end, I do have to leave it behind at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this is actually the highest ranked scenario that has Cam in it. But number 4, we do have Cam versus MJ. And I think in order for this scenario to happen, I think Chelsea would need to be true to having this Cam and MJ Final 3, where I do think it's probably in Chelsea's best interest to have Cam and MJ in the Final 3, and I don't think it's that unreasonable for her to want to cut Rubina towards the end. So I think there's definitely a world where Cam, Chelsea, and MJ are in the Final 3, Cam wins Final HOH, cuts Chelsea, and we get to this Final 2 scenario, which again, I think is probably the most likely one to have Cam in it. And I think if it were to happen, it would actually be a pretty close battle where in my calculation, I do have Cam getting 3 votes in the likes of Quinn, Kimo, and Rubina, while MJ also gets 3 votes in T-Core, Leah, and Chelsea, with Angela being the swing vote. And I don't really know where Angela would sign this, considering she talked pretty negatively about both of them in her exit interview, where she called Cam a floater and she called MJ gullible. So who knows where Angela truly stands here. However, I think another thing to factor in is I am assuming in this scenario that it's Cam winning final HOH and cutting Chelsea, which I think if that's the context, I think that could be a major factor in pushing Cam over the edge, where I think through that, the jury could respect Cam for taking out the biggest player, while they see MJ as being the puppet behind Chelsea and kind of a follower there. So I think realistically, if the scenario were to happen based off the path there, I think Cam probably wins. But I do think it would be relatively close, as I think both of them would have pretty locked votes. But it's for that reason that I have it here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this top 3 is all under the assumption that we get a Chelsea MJ Rubina final 3, where the assumption is that Kimo goes out at final 5, and then they cut Cam at final 4, giving us this final 3, and it's just a matter of ordering it. But at number 3, we do have Chelsea versus Rubina. And I think the reason why this one's the least likely is that I think Rubina is the most likely to be kicked out of this final 3. And I think even if Rubina is kept around and is in the position to take out Chelsea, I just don't see how Rubina doesn't take that shot. Where I think the fact that Rubina and Kimo both recognize that Chelsea is this big threat makes it more likely that Rubina would cut Chelsea if she had the opportunity. And then conversely, I think Chelsea has some opportunity to kick Rubina out of this final 3, maybe rope Cam back into it. So I think those factors are what leaves this final 2 up in the air. But I think if it were to happen, I think Chelsea would be the clear frontrunner here, getting most of the jury votes here. Now, I think Cam could be a question over whether he votes for Chelsea or not. But I do think Kimo would be a clear vote for Rubina. But I think every other vote probably goes to Chelsea in a scenario here. I just don't see Rubina really putting up much of a case against Chelsea. But again, I think there's still some extenuating circumstances that could lead to this scenario not happening, which is why it's here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and this is a scenario that's a bit more likely, but obviously has one thing limiting it, and that is MJ versus Rubina. Now, again, if we are in a scenario where there is actually a Chelsea Rubina MJ final 3, and Rubina has the opportunity to cut Chelsea, I think Rubina does so, and I think that's the most likely path for us to get this final 2. Now, obviously, there's still a question over whether Rubina would target MJ or not at final 4 if the plan were to change, and obviously whether Chelsea would target Rubina at final 4 if she had the opportunity to do so, as Chelsea pretty clearly wants to take MJ deeper into the game. So I think those things are what keep this scenario from being number 1. But if it were to happen, I actually think Rubina would win here. I think Rubina being the one to cut Chelsea would give her a lot of credit in the eyes of the jury, and I think she would win pretty handily here. And I think there are a number of things going for her as well, with a lot of people being pretty open to voting for her in a scenario that doesn't have Chelsea in it. I think Rubina would get a lot of those votes, where the only vote I can see MJ getting is possibly Chelsea. But I think it's not out of the realm of possibility that Rubina is the winner of Big Brother 26, and this is the path that she takes to get there. But I think the fact that she would still need to get to the final 3 to begin with, the fact that she would need to win final HOH and actually be willing to cut Chelsea here, is enough of a question mark that I had to leave it here at number 2. And now at number 1, the final 2 scenario I believe is the most likely to happen on this season is Chelsea versus MJ. And obviously, this is probably the most boring scenario and one that I know a lot of people would be pretty underwhelmed by. However, I think it is somewhat likely to happen, where at this point, both Chelsea and MJ want to take each other to the end. And even at the point where MJ was told that she would probably lose to Chelsea if she got to the end, she just doesn't seem to care that much. And I think considering their comparability, considering that these are 2 of the biggest competitors on the season, I wouldn't put it past them to just win out and get to this very scenario. And if the scenario were to happen, I do think Chelsea would win. However, I think the actual vote count could be a bit interesting here, where even though the perception is that MJ is Chelsea's puppet and that Chelsea is the true mastermind of the season, I do think MJ could get some votes here, where you have someone like Rubina who told MJ that she probably would vote for MJ in a Chelsea MJ final 2, which makes no sense for Rubina to be saying unless she actually meant it, where you would think that if Rubina thought that Chelsea would beat MJ in a final 2, that she would try to sway MJ away from taking Chelsea to the end. But the fact that Rubina is actually telling MJ that not only is a Chelsea MJ final 2 not that bad for her, but that she would actually vote for MJ in that scenario, makes me think that Rubina's being serious here. Not to mention that you have Kimo, who said recently that he actually wants to be bitter on the jury, and while it's unclear whether he's actually being serious here as well, I do think it also presents the possibility that Kimo could be an MJ vote. And then you have Leah, who, again, even though Leah should be upset at MJ for betraying her, I think Leah is also someone that values loyalty, and she could see MJ taking Chelsea to the end as a sign of MJ's loyalty and something that she wants to reward. So I think there are definitely opportunities for MJ to get votes here to where it could make it a relatively close vote there, and who knows how that rubs off on the rest of the jury. So I think those things kind of make this scenario a bit more interesting if it were to actually happen. Though at the end of the day, I do expect Chelsea to actually win it. And considering that these two openly want to take each other to the end, considering they have shown quite a bit of compatibility and the ability to actually get their way, I do think this is the most likely scenario to happen. And it's for that reason that's here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now once the season ends, I plan to do a player ranking where I rank these players based on how well I think they played across the season, so stay tuned for that. I'm covering Survivor 47 and Hell's Kitchen, so you can expect future content on those shows. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.